We've been, last time we got together before I left, I started to give a recap on some of the topics that we learned about, that were talked about at the recent Chafer Seminary Pastors Conference. And the first thing that I chose to look at was the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the way we look at our Bible. I wouldn't say it changed the way we look at our Bible. It sure fortified the way we look at this book, though. And made the underpinnings of our Bible and the preservation of God for His own Word very, very stable. So again, when we ended last time, one of the verses that I put on the board, I started with the fact that God wants us to know the Word, live by the Word, and so God then has to obligate Himself to preserve the Word. You know, each of us are going to live, a certain number of years, our lifespan, maybe call it 100 years if you will. But we can't do anything for what happened 2,000 years ago when Paul wrote the book. We weren't there 1,800 years ago when people were trying to translate it into different languages. When people like Origen and Augustine and all these people got a hold of the book, we weren't there. We didn't have anything to do with what was happening with the Bible text itself as years went by on the human scale. We were absolutely powerless to do anything to preserve the book so that when we came along 2,000 years later, it would still be a trustworthy, reliable document. So God had to make Himself the one that was going to preserve the Word. We saw this in Psalm 119 concerning the Bible, the thing that we're supposed to live by. And in Psalm 119:89, the psalmist says, "Forever, Yahweh, your word is settled in heaven." And so we had to ask that pesky question. Yes, in heaven, all things are settled. All things are unchangeable. All things are true and pure and perfect and righteous. But earth is a wildly different place from heaven. And how can we assure that what we have in our hands on earth, this corrupt place we live in, how can we be sure that this Bible is a reliable, trustworthy transmission of what God wants us to know? It's a pesky question for sure. So in heaven, again, your word is settled, but on earth there are people that want to pervert the word. Satan is always busy trying to pervert, at least pervert, if not destroy the Bible. And so we turn to this thing that was found, these scrolls that were found in 1947 and 48 in Israel called the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm going to go through this quickly. That what shouldn't be there. I'm going to go through this quickly and fix this. Because that drives me nutty. We talked about this last time. What are they, these Dead Sea Scrolls? The who, the questions, the who, what, when, where questions, very quickly to get back into this. Who is responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls? And we saw it was the Jews. It was a sect of Jews in Qumran, Israel, most likely the Essenes. I say most likely just to leave a 0.01% chance that it was anyone else, because we know this is who it was. The Essenes were a sect of Israel, just like the Pharisees were a sect and the Sadducees were a sect. There were three major sects, and the Essenes were one of them. So the Jews were responsible for these writings. But why would God choose these particular people? Remember, no mistakes in God's world. All things are perfectly orderly. And these Essenes were different than the Pharisees, who were legalists, and different from the Sadducees, who didn't believe in many of the miracles that were recorded in the Old Testament. The Sadducees were not spiritual thinkers. The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees had a lot of problems. The Essenes were the purest of the three sects. And when I say pure, I mean pure as in keeping the law as God transmitted it to Moses. And that's important. Why is that important? If God would have had the Sadducees write the Dead Sea Scrolls and we found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 in Israel, there would have been a lot of problems in the Dead Sea Scrolls because the Sadducees would have taken out a lot of the miraculous, a lot of the spiritual things that the Bible speaks of. I wonder if we'd have the story of Jonah swallowed by a big fish, or if the Sadducees would have changed the verbiage of the story to take the miracle out of it. I wonder if we'd have had the story of Jericho and the falling down of the wall after the men marched around the wall and blew their trumpets and screamed out loud. I wonder if the Sadducees would have changed that story. But the Essenes wouldn't, because they respected the law very, very much. They lived a very, very strict strict lifestyle. And they were thought to be the descendants of the Zadok priesthood. Well, that's important because when Zerubbabel came back to Israel and rebuilt the temple with Ezra and Nehemiah, the priesthood was Zadokian. It was Zadok. He was a great man, a pure man that God had called out to lead the priesthood in Israel again. All these things are important because of who the Essenes are and why we can trust the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because these people were very, very strict keepers of the law. They loved the law. They were trying to live by the law. They weren't trying to pervert it. And so they would have been very, very careful and accurate in copying the Old Testament into the Hebrew that they copied it into. It was a tribe of scribes. They were all in areas. They had scribal rooms, upstairs scribal rooms, and this was their lives, copying the Scripture. What were the Dead Sea Scrolls? What do we find in the caves? I'll show you pictures in just a minute. They're fragments. They're pieces of the Old Testament. Not only the Old Testament, though, there are also pieces of other religious writings and writings about how they lived in community there. So it's not just Bible. It's other things that were found in these caves in Qumran in 1947 in Israel along the Dead Sea. So that's what they are. The scrolls are fragments of Old Testament writings. I told you last time, I'll say it again, every book of the Bible, they have fragments that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls of every single Old Testament book. Remember, this is Hebrew. This is Hebrew. We're not talking about New Testament Pauline writings. We're talking about ancient Old Testament Hebrew. They found copies of everything in the Dead Sea Scrolls except for the book of Esther. And we talked about why I think the book of Esther was left out last time. Not because it's not part of Scripture, but because they carried Esther very near and dear because of the annual celebration of Purim. When were the Dead Sea Scrolls written? Another important thing, 250 BC to 70 AD. So the Dead Sea Scrolls start, we know these years because we have real good historical evidence of when the Essenes lived in this area of Qumran. That's archaeology. So about 250 years before Jesus came to earth, and they lived through the Jesus years, and they went on into 70 AD when Rome finally went to Qumran and destroyed the city that was there. So that's the period in which these people lived. This will start to make more sense in just a minute because I actually made a little timeline to try to describe this better. Qumran community destroyed by the Roman Empire in 70 AD. I just told you that. Concerning the when, the timeline, these fragments were untouched. Imagine this. In 70 AD, there was no more Essene, no more member of this community that could put one of these scrolls into one of these clay pots and put it in a cave. That was finished by 70 AD. So those fragments weren't touched until 1948. They were found in 1947. Israel gained her independence as a nation in 1948. And one of the very first things Israel did was go into Qumran and get these fragments. They went after the scrolls. They knew the value of the scrolls. So they went after the scrolls, but they were untouched until 1948, almost a 2,000-year period of incubation. Who kept them? Who kept the animals out of those caves? Who kept those scrolls safe in those clay pots? It was God Himself. It was God himself who preserved the Word in caves in Qumran for 2,000 years so that in 1948 we could go back and find them. What's the where of Qumran? It's in Israel. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures now. It's along the Dead Sea. This is Qumran cave number 1, where they found a great number of the scrolls, including the Isaiah scroll, which was 100% complete. A lot of fragments, but some of the books were 100% complete, including the Isaiah scroll. So that's it. You can see how remote that cave is, how hard it would have been for a man to get into that cave. You can't just walk up to it. You can't climb to it. It's on a sheer cliff. You'd have to be lowered down into it from above. It was just a beautiful place for God to preserve His Word for all these years. Looking around to the right, just to show you the countryside, very barren, very arid, very little precipitation there. I'll show you a picture in just a minute. The Dead Sea is right behind us. But very, very dry area. It'd be a great place to have a classic car because it wouldn't rust for decades. If you turn around from that video I just showed you, this is what you see. The Dead Sea is right there. Qumran is on the shores of the Dead Sea. Maybe, I don't remember exactly. I don't remember the line of sight, but maybe 2,000 yards away from the Dead Sea is this community of Qumran. And this is what they found. They found these ancient pots. Yeah, obviously, this isn't in a cave, but these are the pots taken to the Jewish Museum. But that's what they were in. So the scrolls were made of parchment, which is dried animal skin. The words of the Old Testament Hebrew were written on the scrolls and rolled up and kept secure for 2,000 years. So that's the who, what, the when of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We went over that last time. But in an effort to try to make this make a little better sense and why the scrolls are significant to us, I want to ask this question. Suppose I want to write a new English Bible. I'm not going to, don't misunderstand. But if I took it upon myself to say I want to write a new version of the Bible as accurate to the original Hebrew and the original Greek as I possibly can make it, if I sat down to write an English translation of the Bible, what would I need? What languages would I need? I would need a Bible, a reliable copy of a Hebrew Old Testament. And yes, there's some Aramaic in the Old Testament, but it's basically a Hebrew book. And I would also need a reliable copy of a Greek New Testament. I would have to gather the best Greek manuscript that I could find, the one that I thought was most closely attached to Paul's original writings. And I would also have to find the best Hebrew manuscript on earth to begin translating it into English. Because if the Hebrew's not accurate, the English is going to be off. You with me? Bible wasn't written in our language. And any English version that you find is a translation. And it was translated from an original. From a copy of the original. So that's the dilemma that I'm trying to paint tonight when I ask this question. What are my choices? If I'm going to make an Old Testament, if I'm going to write an English version of the Old Testament, and I go into ancient texts and try to find the best Hebrew copy so that I can translate that into English, what are my options? I'm trying to answer the question, why are the Dead Sea Scrolls so important? What are my options? I'm going to answer the question. I tell you, in the New Testament, we have tens of thousands of fragments of Greek writings that are ancient. In the New Testament, but in the Old Testament Hebrew, we only have 2 or 3 choices. It's not these tens of thousands of fragments. It's like count them on one hand and take your pick. This is all we have. So if I'm trying to translate a Hebrew, an original copy of the Hebrew into English, these are my choices. Number one is the Samaritan Pentateuch, or the Samaritan Torah. Now the Samaritans, as you know, were Jews. They lived in Israel. They stayed in Israel after Israel was kicked out. After the Jews were kicked out of Israel and sent to Babylon, some of the poorest of the Jews stayed in Israel, and they intermarried with Babylonians and people from other places that Nebuchadnezzar brought down. And these, if you will, I hate this phrase, but if you will, these half-breed people, half Jew and half Gentile, became the Samaritans. And the Samaritans, in their remember the story of the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well, the woman in Samaria. The Samaritans didn't have an Old Testament text that went all the way from Moses all the way to Malachi. The Samaritans only believed that the first 5 books of Moses were inspired by God. Nothing else mattered to them. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and that was their Bible. And so the Samaritans had a slightly different language, slightly different writing, but we have a very good copy of the Samaritan Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible that were written by Moses. That's all they believed in. That's all they studied. Judaism is very much the same today. My choice, the Samaritan Pentateuch. Let's talk about it just for a minute. What was good about it? What's valuable about it? And can I use it if I'm trying to translate a very, very good English Bible, or is it not a good choice? It was written between 100 BC, so 100 years before Jesus was born, or so, and 180, 100 years after Jesus was born. Written by the Samaritans, again, who only believed these 5 books to be inspired by God. If you'll remember the story, when Jesus is speaking to that woman at the well, if you'll remember what she said, the Samaritans made a great deal out of Mount Gerizim, which is in their territory. And they actually worshipped on Mount Gerizim. And if you'll remember that story of the woman at the well, she says to Jesus that our fathers worshipped on this hill, but your fathers worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus said there's a time coming when you'll neither worship on this hill or in Jerusalem. And that's the Samaritans. That is their religion. That is what they believed. I'd read it to you if I could find it, but it's not in my head. Probably good. It would take too much time. That's the Samaritans. We have a book that the Samaritans wrote. We have a Samaritan Pentateuch. We have a good copy of their 5 books of Moses. Another thing about the Samaritans, they reject Joshua, as I said. After the 5 books of Moses, they reject every book of the Old Testament that comes after that, from Joshua to Malachi, and they reject the entire New Testament. To the Samaritans, the only thing that mattered was the first 5 books of the Bible. So I have that copy. I can go get a copy. You can look it up on the internet, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and read it. If you could read it, but you can see it. We have that document. But as far as accuracy and reliability, if I'm going to make my New Testament English translation, do I want to use this Hebrew writing, or is there something better? That's the question. I want the best Hebrew manuscript I can find to translate from. As far as accuracy and reliability, this copy of Torah was written 300 to 500 years after the close of the Old Testament. 300 to 500 years. Malachi writes in about 400 BC. 300 to 500 years go by, and this document comes along and is finished. And not only does it have some years away from the close of the Old Testament scriptures, it's also woefully incomplete. No Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, Psalms, Song of Solomon, nothing. No Isaiah, no Jeremiah, nothing. Just 5 books of the Old Testament. Would you use that to translate your fancy New English Translation Bible? Is the Samaritan Pentateuch a reliable and accurate source? I've got another choice. Again, remember what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to write a New Testament English. I'm trying to write an English version of the Bible, a new version. And I'm looking for the best Hebrew on earth. I've got this book called the Septuagint or the Septuagint. You'll read it, you'll see it spoken of as the LXX, which is the Roman word for 70, the Roman numeral 70. They also call it the 70. You can see that in the septa part of it, the 7 in the septa. So the Septuagint is this Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. The good thing about the Septuagint is that it's all there. From Genesis all the way to Malachi, it's all there. It was written in about 250, that's what circa means, approximately. It was written in about 250 BC, before Jesus, in Alexandria, Egypt. Do you see a big problem with it so far? A Greek copy of the Hebrew Old Testament is what it is. Now, why did the Jews need a copy of the Old Testament in Greek? Why would they need that? They're Jews. They speak Hebrew. Why would the Jews need a copy of their own Bible, their own scrolls in Greek? What's the answer? Remember, after first I'll say this, the Roman world, the Roman Empire, remember the Greek Empire came before the Roman Empire, and the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, had a great Koine Greek language, a common Greek language that had spread throughout the empire. Everybody was speaking Greek. And when Rome came along and took over from the Greeks, the language of the Roman Empire was still Greek. Latin didn't come along for a while. It was still Greek. So the Roman world spoke Greek, so the Jewish rabbis sought to preserve the Hebrew Old Testament in a language that the Jews could understand. Remember also this fact that when Israel came back from Babylon, if you look in Ezra and Nehemiah and you add the numbers up, only about 40,000, I think it's like 42,000 or so Jews came back into the land. 42,000, that's nothing. That's a tiny number. 42,000 Jews went back into the land of Israel. Most of them stayed in their scattered places, Babylon, Macedonia, all the places they'd been scattered to. So they knew at this time, 250 BC, before Jesus got there, when the Romans ruled the world, the Jews had lost the Hebrew language to a great extent, and the Hebrews wanted to teach the scrolls to their people, the Jews, in a language they could understand. They were Greek speakers. So they set out to write the Hebrew Bible in Greek. It's a complete copy. Like I said, the good thing is it's complete from the Old Testament, from Genesis all the way to Malachi. But the problem is I'm trying to find the best Hebrew text I can find with which to start my translation work, and this book isn't Hebrew. It's Greek. It's ancient, and that's good. But it's not in the language I'm looking for. What I'm trying to say is it's also a copy or a translation itself. Why would I want a middleman? Why would I want to go from Hebrew to Greek and then to English? I don't want that. I want to go from the best Hebrew I can find directly to my language, English. But it's a choice. I can use the Septuagint if I know Greek and Hebrew and translate my New English Bible. As far as accuracy and reliability, what do I have to say about the Septuagint? It's written 150 to 200 years after the close of the Old Testament. It's close to the days of Malachi. Not a ton of centuries has gone by, but it's Greek, not Hebrew. Why in the world would I want to translate from Greek into English the Old Testament, which was written in Hebrew. You find the problem, right? I have one more choice. In all of the world in which we live, I only have one more choice. When it comes to the Old Testament Hebrew script, maintained and preserved by God so that I can use it to translate an English Bible. And that's the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text. So let's talk about this for just a minute, the Masoretic text. What is it? It was completed in the 10th century AD. That's the 900s. The 900s. Not 1900s, 900s. It's an ancient book. Completed in the 10th century. Probably took them 200 years to do all the work, the Masoretes in the text. It was written by Jewish rabbis and scribes. They called themselves the Masoretes. And they were on a mission. They were on a mission to preserve the Old Testament in the Hebrew language of the Jew, of Moses. Not the Greek Septuagint. They wanted a translation in Hebrew. And so the Jewish rabbis and the scribes set out to take as many fragments as they could find and to write and preserve for the world a proper and accurate and reliable Old Testament in the original Hebrew language. This is the best choice I would have. What else did the Masoretes do? I told you that certainly by this time, 900 AD, the Jews have been scattered for almost 1,000 years under the cycle of discipline of the Lord. They rejected Jesus. He scattered them to the four corners of the earth. Destroyed the temple, destroyed Jerusalem. And so the Jews have been all over the world. So part of the mission that these rabbis and scribes, these Masoretes was on, part of their mission was to maintain the heritage of Hebrew, the language. It was being lost. Everybody was speaking. What does it say when you get to the book of Acts in chapter 2 and you start learning about tongues? Listen to all the languages that all these Greeks. Are these not all Galileans who were speaking our own language, the languages in which we were born? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya adjoining Cyrene, visitors from Rome, Cretans, Arabs. The Jews were everywhere. And they were losing Hebrew. They weren't speaking Hebrew. As a matter of fact, until 1948, when the Jews went aliyah and started going back into the land of Israel, Hebrew was all but dead. And the rabbis and the people of Israel got back together and went back into the language and have restored the language of Hebrew for the nation Israel. It was all but lost. So these Masoretes, looking at what's coming, try to preserve the Hebrew language and the heritage of the Old Testament Mosaic law and the writings in Hebrew. Thank God for these Masoretes. You know what's other interesting thing about the Masoretes? Let me ask this question. Does God in His plan for mankind ever use unbelievers? Who are these guys? I'm telling you, on this earth, the greatest copy of the Hebrew Bible that we have was written and completed in the 900 AD time period by a group of unbelieving Jews. They preserved the book. God had these Jews preserve this book. This English version of this Hebrew Bible right here was translated from the Masoretic text. Not from the Septuagint and not from the Pentateuch, the Samaritan Pentateuch. Translated from the Masoretic text that was preserved by God through the people, rabbis and scribes, these Masoretes. When anybody ever says, oh, God can't use an unbeliever, I'm not saying it's a positive thing. I'm saying don't limit God. Because the preservation of our Bible in the Hebrew language was a work of unbelieving rabbis and scribes. They added vowel points. In trying to keep the language of Hebrew alive, they added vowel points Vowels. A-E-I-O-U. Because the Hebrew, the way it was written for millennia before that, never had any vowels in it. So my name would not be R-I-C-K, my name would be R-C-K, but you would know because you speak the language, oh, that's Rick. That word that I see there is Rick. But the Masoretes knew the world that's non-Hebrew and non-Jewish will never be able to pronounce our language if we don't write it in a way that's pronounceable. So they came up with this system of vowel points and markings so the non-Hebrew speaking world would know how to pronounce the words of the language of God, the language of Moses, Hebrew. It's fascinating how God has had to preserve this Bible. The good thing about the Masoretic text, it's a complete copy of the Old Testament and it's written in Hebrew. Not in Greek like the Septuagint, it's written in Hebrew. As far as accuracy and reliability, it was written now listen to this, remember the last one, written 150 to 200 years after the close of the Old Testament. What about this great book, the Masoretic text, 1,400 years after the close of the Old Testament? 1,400 years go by when the Masoretes come along and say, we've got to preserve this book in Hebrew. That's a massive amount of human history. Maybe 15 to 18% of all human history that's gone by went by in that period of time between the close of the Old Testament and the writing of this Hebrew book, the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Old Testament. But it's complete and it's in Hebrew, so it's my only choice, really. But here's the question. How do I know between these three books, how do I know that any of them are accurate? How, if I'm going to write an English translation of the Bible starting right now, how do I know that I can trust any of these texts? How do I know that they're pure and that they're the words that God gave Moses? How do you know? Just to see it all on one slide here, the Samaritan Pentateuch, or the Torah, is ancient. It was written 300 to 500 years after the Old Testament, after Malachi finished his writing. 300 to 500 years go by before they arranged this thing. And the problem with it is they didn't arrange but 5 books of it. You go down to the next choice, the Septuagint, and only 150 to 200 years has gone by since Malachi wrote his last word. But it's written in Greek. It itself is a translation. So how do I know that they translated the Septuagint accurately from the Hebrew? There is an answer to that. You know what that answer is? The New Testament. When the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it most often uses the Greek translation of the Septuagint. You want to know if Jesus trusted the Septuagint? Go to Jesus' words and see that he quoted from the Septuagint. It is a proper copy, but I'm a linguist. I'm not, but if I were and I was writing this English book, I would want to have a Hebrew Bible to work from, not a Greek Bible, no matter how good it might be. And so the next choice we have, the last one, the only one, is the Masoretic text. And as we see, the Masoretic text is written 1,400 years after the close of the Old Testament. Yes, it's complete. Yes, it's in Hebrew. But the time period that's gone by between the end of Malachi and the writing of the Masoretic text, 1,400 years, how can I know I can trust it? That's the question of it all. It's the best book we've had for centuries, for 1,000 years. It's the best translation of the Hebrew Old Testament we've had on this earth for centuries. How do we know if it's right? And enter in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are my choices for an Old Testament Hebrew New English translation. I'm writing a New English translation in the Old Testament the Hebrew language, these are my choices. I put this up front, 400 AC or up first, because this is when Malachi was written. 400 BC or so, 400 years before Jesus comes, Malachi writes his letter. These are my choices. We've already gone over. I just wanted to show it to you in a different way. Maybe something will click a little sharper, a little brighter. The Samaritan Pentateuch. It was written between the period that the arrows show from 100 years before Jesus, you see the cross there, to 100 years after Jesus. The problem with it, it's only the Torah. It's only the Torah, and it's written by people who have a not great notion about the veracity of the Bible. They reject most of the Old Testament. So why would I go to that for any reason? They don't believe the inerrancy of the Bible the way that I do. I'm going to reject the Samaritan Pentateuch altogether. We have another choice. Here it is right here in history. The Septuagint, 250 BC. The problem with the Septuagint, what is it? It's Greek. I don't want a translation of the Hebrew. I want Hebrew. So I'm not going to go to the Septuagint for heavy linguistic work in the languages to try to write a new English version of the Bible. I've got one other choice, and it's my only choice. And that is the Masoretic text, a complete Hebrew Bible written by unbelieving rabbis and scribes, completed in the 900s AD. It's the distance from the writing of Malachi. Just look at it. Look how close the Septuagint is in time. Even the Samaritan Pentateuch, it's close in time. But my goodness, the Masoretic text goes over the cross and goes almost 1,000 years down the road. Look at the distance between the writing of the book and the copy. The writing of the Old Testament with Malachi and our great copy, the Masoretic text, almost 1,400 years of human history. How do I know I can trust that Masoretic text? It's because of this cave right here. It's because for almost 2,000 years, God preserved in that very cave the scrolls of the Old Testament in original Hebrew writing. So what we have here is that somewhere around this time right here, somewhere where that arrow is, they started writing in 250 or so. They finished AD 70. At least that's the last opportunity they had to put something in a cave before Rome destroyed Qumran, the place where the scrolls are. In comes the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I said everything I said to say this right here. The Dead Sea Scrolls, complete. They have fragments of every Old Testament book. Many of them are very, very complete. Isaiah is 100% complete. The only book that's missing is the book of Esther, and also written in Hebrew. You say, but Rick, it's not complete. Don't you need a complete Hebrew Bible if you're going to translate from the Hebrew into your New English Bible? Don't you want everything? Yes is the answer to that. So I still lean on the Masoretic text because it's my best choice. What the Dead Sea Scrolls did for the Masoretic text is this. This book, these scrolls, these fragments that were found in those caves in the 40s, the 1940s, and this book, the Masoretic text that was written 1,000 years ago, are all but identical. So you have to ask the question, I do as a writer of the text. If I'm going to use the Masoretic text because it's a complete Hebrew Bible, and I'm going to use that to translate my new Bible into English, I have to ask and answer the question, is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? Is it pure to the writings that Malachi wrote on a page? Or has it been horribly perverted? And the beauty of the Dead Sea Scrolls is that it takes ancient Hebrew writings, and when you see what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the days before Jesus, and you see that Masoretic text written 1,000 years after Jesus, and you hold them up to one another, they're the same thing. Tiny little changes. Like a problem with an L being replaced by a T, tiny little scribal errors. Other than these tiny little errors, and there are a lot of tiny little errors. Imagine our language with I's that you dot. If you get lazy, maybe it looks like an L, an F with a loop at the top in a line. Maybe if you get lazy, you don't hook that loop, so they mistake it for a T. We've got a lot of letters that are very, very similar. A B, a D. They're scribal errors. They're errors that the human eye makes and translates into the pen. The truths that are written in the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls are identical. So all these Bibles that we have, the New King James, the King James, the New American Standard, all these Bibles, the English part of the Bible, or the Old Testament part written in English, all came from the Masoretic text. And so what the Dead Sea Scrolls did for us when we read the book is give us the confidence to say, this book is right. That Hebrew Masoretic text that we've been using for almost 1,000 years, over 1,000 years, 900 AD, we're 2,000 whatever we were, over 1,000, 1,120 years. That book that we've been using for 1,120 years is, as you could say, for sake of argument, it's exactly like the book that the Essenes wrote in Qumran, these Dead Sea Scrolls, 1,400 years earlier. Same book, same words, same thoughts, same God, same 6-day creation. Listen to me. Same 6-day creation, same creation of Adam on day 6, same fall from God, same deliverer promised in Genesis 3, same flood of Noah in Genesis chapter 6, same call of Abraham later in Genesis chapter 12, same Bible. You got people that say, I just don't know how you can trust that Bible. God has made it abundantly clear through this great finding in 1947 of these Dead Sea Scrolls that I do want you to live according to my word, and I'll see to it that the word stays pure. Don't you worry about a thing. I'll see to it. If I'm going to judge you, save you, reward you, glorify you based on this book and what I've taught in this book, I will see to it that this book remains pure. Don't worry about a thing. That's the God we serve. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls give us, among other things. So the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Masoretic text separated in human time by over 1,000 years, yet they teach identical truths. They are identical books for all intents and purposes. They are identical. Only God, and you know this as well as I do, only God could keep this book so pure when Satan roams around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. If he wants to destroy you, and this is the book that God says we gain our instruction through in order to please him, if Satan wants to drive us away from God, this is the first thing he's coming after. And God says, you can't have it. These are my children. And for all eternity, they're going to be judged and evaluated based on what this book says. Satan, you can't touch it. I'll preserve it for them. You watch me do it. And he's done it for thousands of years. If God expects us then, my last statement, if God expects us to live according to the Word of God, the Bible, and he does, then he must preserve it for us over time. It's his job, not yours. It's his job, not mine. completely an issue of God. Nothing I can do to solve that. Nothing I can do to aid it, to help it, to push it along. It's completely in the purview of God for over thousands of years to preserve this book for me. The Dead Sea Scrolls then prove, that God has faithfully and accurately preserved the original Hebrew Old Testament for thousands of years. Thousands of years. Since the days of Moses, this Old Testament text has been kept pure and preserved by God Himself. He's the only one that could ever have done it. And He's done it. The Dead Sea Scrolls prove that God has faithfully and accurately preserved His original Hebrew Old Testament for thousands of years. That's the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's close in prayer. Father,